You think you know the people you love, but sometimes, the most important chapters of their lives are the ones they never read aloud. I spent my whole life thinking my grandfather was a simple man. A farmer. A father. A man whose biggest battles were with the weather and the price of corn. His hands, rough and calloused from a lifetime of work, were the steadiest hands I've ever known. They could fix a tractor engine or tie a fishing fly with equal, quiet precision. But they never once, not in all my 40-odd years, picked up a pen to write down his story. And if you're the kind of person who believes every story deserves to be told, well, maybe you'll understand why I had to share this one with you. Consider subscribing if you've ever looked at someone you love and wondered what secrets they're keeping, just beneath the surface. Our story begins, as so many of the best ones do, in the quiet hum of a summer evening. The screen door squeaked on its hinge, a sound as familiar as my own heartbeat. The smell of cut grass and grilling burgers hung heavy in the air. And there he'd be, in his worn-out porch rocker, a glass of iced tea sweating in the humidity. I'd sit on the top step, tracing patterns in the peeling paint, and I'd ask him, "Grandpa, tell me about the war." It was a ritual. His answer was always the same. A slow, sad smile would touch his eyes for just a moment before fading. He'd take a long sip of his tea, the ice cubes clinking like distant chimes. "Ah, sport," he'd say, his voice a low rumble. Some stories are better left in the past where they belong. And that would be that. He'd turn the conversation to the tomatoes in his garden or the fish that were biting down at the old creek. I accepted it. We all did. His silence was just a part of him, like his flannel shirts and his fondness for butterscotch candies. It was a closed door, and we respected it. The man I knew was defined by peace. He rose with the sun, not an alarm clock. He could tell the time by the angle of the light falling across his fields. His world was one of patience and seasons, of sowing and reaping. He found profound joy in the simplest of things, the first ripe strawberry of the summer, the sound of rain on a tin roof, the weight of a grandchild on his shoulders. He was the rock upon which our entire family was built. Steady. Dependable. Unchanging. Or so I thought. His past was a country I had never visited, a language I did not speak. There were clues, of course, if you knew where to look. A slight stiffness in his right leg when the weather turned cold. A fleeting shadow that would cross his face at the sudden backfire of a car. And the way he'd sometimes stare off into the distance, his eyes focused on something miles, or perhaps decades, away. But these were just fragments. Pieces of a puzzle I never dreamed I'd be able to put together. He was my grandfather, and that was enough for me. It had to be. The catalyst for everything was a simple phone call. It was a Tuesday. My mother's voice on the other end was thin, frayed with a grief I could feel through the receiver. "He's gone, honey," was all she could manage. The world, for a moment, lost its sound. The steady, metronomic rhythm of my life had just stopped. The funeral was a blur of somber suits and soft condolences. People spoke of his kindness, his integrity, his love for his family. They spoke of the man he was for the 50 years after the war. But the man before, that man was a ghost. A nameless, faceless entity. We gathered back at the old farmhouse, the rooms feeling too large without his presence to fill them. It was my job, as the eldest grandson, to start going through his things in the study. It was a room that always smelled of old books, lemon polish, and pipe tobacco. It was his sanctuary. The desk was an oak behemoth, its surface scarred and stained with ink and time. I started with the drawers. Receipts from the feed store dating back to the 70s. Manuals for machinery that hadn't run in decades. A collection of pocket knives, each one meticulously sharpened. And then, in the bottom drawer, tucked all the way in the back behind a box of stationery, my fingers brushed against cold, worn leather. I pulled it out. It was a small lockbox, no bigger than a large book. It was plain, unadorned, but it felt heavy. heavy with more than just its physical weight. It felt significant. There was a small, brass keyhole, but no key. My heart began to beat a little faster. This felt different. This felt like a secret. I shook it gently. Something inside shifted with a soft, solid thud. This was it. The door he had kept closed for a lifetime. And now, I was standing on the threshold, holding the keyhole in my hands. I'm not a man who breaks things. I believe in order, in respecting boundaries. But the pull of that box was a physical force. It was a whisper from the grave, an invitation from the grandfather I realized I never truly knew. I found a flathead screwdriver in the garage, my hands trembling slightly. With a groan of protesting metal, the old lock gave way. The lid creaked open, releasing a scent of aged paper, dried leather, and dust. I peered inside. My breath caught in my throat. There, resting on a faded piece of velvet, was a medal. But not just any medal. It was a Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor. The blue ribbon was faded, but the five-pointed star gleamed in the dim light of the study. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be his. It must have been his father's from the First World War. A family heirloom he'd never mentioned. But beneath the medal, that's where the real story began. There was a bundle of letters, tied with a faded red ribbon. And a small, black and white photograph. The photograph was curled at the edges. It showed a group of young soldiers, their uniforms dirty, their faces lean and tired, but their smiles were wide and genuine. They were leaning against the side of a jeep. And there, in the middle, was my grandfather. But he was a stranger. He couldn't have been more than 19. His face was unlined, his eyes held a light I had never seen in them, and he had his arms slung around the shoulders of the man next to him. This other soldier was grinning at the camera, a cigarette dangling from his lip, his helmet tipped back on his head. He looked like he was in the middle of laughing. They looked inseparable. Who was this young man who laughed in the face of war? And who was this friend whose memory was so powerful that my grandfather had kept his picture hidden away for a lifetime? This was not the quiet, reserved man I knew. This was a boy, full of life and camaraderie. The disconnect was jarring. It was like looking at a photograph of a twin brother I never knew he had. I carefully untied the ribbon around the letters. The paper was brittle, the ink a faded brown. The handwriting was unmistakably his, a younger, quicker version of the precise script I knew from birthday cards. But these weren't letters sent home. The first one began, "My dearest Eleanor." Eleanor. My grandmother's name was Rose. A cold dread began to pool in my stomach. Who was Eleanor? I read on. The letter was filled with the hopeful, desperate words of a young man far from home, clinging to the thought of the girl he loved. He wrote about the rain in England, the mud of France, the fear that was a constant companion. He wrote about his friend, Charlie. Charlie says we'll be home by Christmas, he wrote. I want to believe him. I want to believe anything he says. He's the best man I've ever known. Charlie. The laughing soldier in the photograph. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it was a picture I didn't understand. My grandfather had a life before my grandmother. A love before my grandmother. A best friend named Charlie. And a medal for valor he never spoke a word about. The mystery was deepening, becoming more profound and more painful with every revelation. The letters were a portal to another world. They were not the ramblings of a boy, but the thoughtful, often poetic, musings of a young man aged far beyond his years. He wrote of the beauty he found amidst the horror, a field of poppies growing near a bombed-out church, the sound of a harmonica floating through the camp at night, the simple, profound comfort of a shared cup of coffee. He wrote of his fears, not of dying, but of forgetting the sound of his mother's voice, or of changing so much that he wouldn't recognize the person he became. And he wrote constantly of Charlie. Charlie from Chicago. Charlie, who could make anyone laugh, who could scrounge up chocolate bars and real coffee from seemingly thin air, who had a photograph of his own sweetheart, a girl named Mary, that he showed to anyone who would look. They had met in basic training, two boys from different worlds thrown together by fate, and had become brothers. Their bond was the central thread running through every letter. They promised to see each other through it all. They made plans for after the war. Charlie was going to come work on the farm. They were going to be partners. In everything. The tone of the letters began to change as the months wore on. The hopefulness began to curdle into a weary realism. The descriptions of the world around him grew darker, more stark. And then, I found the letter dated June 3, 1944. The writing was hurried, shaky. "My dearest Eleanor," it began. "We are moving out tonight. I cannot say where, you know that. But it feels different. Big. Charlie is quiet for once. Not scared, just serious. He gave me a letter to mail to Mary if, well, just if. I have one for you, too, in my pack. I'm not afraid for myself, Ellie. But I am terrified for him. He's got too much life in him for this place. I have to bring him home. I have to. It's the only thing that matters now." The letter ended there. There was no signature. It was as if he'd been interrupted. My hands were trembling. I knew my history. June 3, 1944. They were heading for the beaches. For Normandy. For D-Day. The following letters were sporadic, written on scraps of paper. They were short, terse. The poetry was gone, replaced by a grim accounting of days. He wrote of the noise, the constant, deafening noise of war. He wrote of the smell of cordite and earth and things he couldn't name. He never wrote of what he saw. Only what he heard and smelled. It was too much to put into words. Then, there was a long gap. No letters for weeks. My heart was pounding as I turned to the next one. It was dated July 18, 1944. The paper was stained with what looked like mud, or perhaps something else. The handwriting was almost illegible, scrawled in a frantic, broken script. It was only a few lines. "Ellie. It's gone. All of it. Charlie is gone. I couldn't keep my promise. It was my fault. All my fault. The world is wrong. The colors are all wrong. Don't wait for me. Forget me. I am nothing now." The words were a cry of agony, a pain so raw and immediate that it transcended decades and leaped off the page, searing itself into my soul. I put the letter down, my vision blurring with tears. What happened? What terrible thing had occurred that could shatter a young man so completely? What promise did he break? The mystery was no longer just a curiosity. It was a weight. A profound, aching sadness for the boy my grandfather had been, for the friend he had lost, for the guilt he had carried silently for the rest of his life. The trail went cold after that. There were no more letters to Eleanor. The next item in the box was a formal, typewritten letter from the War Department, informing a Mr. Charles Finney of Chicago that his son, Private Charles Finney, had been killed in action on July 16, 1944, during the Normandy campaign. He was posthumously awarded the Purple Heart. My grandfather had kept Charlie's official death notice. Why? Was it a form of penance? A constant reminder of his failure? The next few letters were from Eleanor. Her handwriting was elegant, looping. The first ones were worried. "My dearest John, I haven't heard from you in weeks. The news from France is terrible. Please, just a word. Let me know you are safe." Her letters grew more desperate, then finally, heartbroken. The last one was returned to her, stamped "Return to Sender." She had written on the back in an angry, slashing script. "Why, John? Why are you doing this? I love you. I would have waited forever. She had given up. He had pushed away the woman he loved, the future they had planned, all because of whatever happened on July 16, 1944. He had chosen a life of silence and solitude as his punishment. But the story didn't end there. Beneath Eleanor's returned letter was a small, folded newspaper clipping from the Chicago Tribune, dated 1947. It was an engagement announcement. Miss Eleanor Shaw is pleased to announce her engagement to Mr. Robert Davies, etc., etc. He had kept that, too. He had tracked her life, even as he removed himself from it. And then, the final letter. It was in a new, unfamiliar envelope, addressed to my grandfather at the farm. The postmark was from Chicago, 1952. The return address simply said, E. Davies. With trembling fingers, I opened it. It was a single sheet of paper. Dear John, it began. I saw your mother at the grocery store last week. She told me you're back on the farm, that you're doing well. She told me you were married last year to a lovely local girl named Rose. I am happy for you, truly I am. I have a daughter now. Her name is Sarah. John, I need you to know something. I never stopped loving you. But I also never stopped being angry with you for shutting me out. I heard about what happened to Charlie. A mutual acquaintance from the old company wrote to me after he got home. He told me a story, John. A story about a young soldier who carried his wounded friend for 2 miles under heavy fire to get him to a medic. A soldier who refused to leave his side. He told me that soldier was awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery. He told me that soldier was you. I stopped reading, the world tilting on its axis. He wasn't responsible for Charlie's death. He had tried to save him. He had performed an act of incredible heroism. I read the rest of the letter through a veil of tears. He told me that Charlie died on the operating table, and that you were inconsolable. You blamed yourself. You said you weren't fast enough, that you should have done more. My dear, sweet John. You carried him. You stayed with him. You did everything humanly possible. You were a hero. And then you came home and buried that hero under a mountain of guilt and silence. You let it steal your future. You let it steal our future. I have a good life now. Robert is a kind man. But my heart will always have a corner that belongs to the boy who wrote me letters about poppy fields and the sound of a harmonica. Please, John. For the sake of the man you are now, and for the wife who loves you, let it go. You are not to blame. You never were. With all my love, always, Eleanor. She knew. She knew the whole time. She knew he was a hero, and she knew the terrible weight of guilt he carried. And she had written to him, years later, to absolve him. To set him free. But he had kept this letter locked away, too. He had never allowed himself to be free. He had chosen the prison of his own making. I sat there in the quiet study for a long time, the letters spread around me like the pieces of a shattered life. The Medal of Honor glinted in the lamplight. It wasn't a symbol of glory. It was a symbol of a promise broken, of a friend lost, of a love sacrificed. It was the heaviest thing I had ever held. My grandfather, the simple farmer, was the most complex man I would ever know. His quiet dignity wasn't just his nature, it was a carefully constructed fortress around a pain so deep it had defined his entire existence. He had chosen a life of quiet service to his family and his land, perhaps because he felt he didn't deserve the louder, brighter future he had once dreamed of. He had loved my grandmother deeply, I knew that. But he had also loved Eleanor, and he had loved Charlie, and he had lost them both on a field in France long before I was ever born. The war stories he never told weren't about battles and strategy. They were stories of love and loyalty, of courage and catastrophic guilt. They were the stories that mattered most. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let his story, or Charlie's, disappear into the dust of that lockbox. I carefully gathered everything up. I made copies of the letters. I took a photograph of the medal. And I started to research. I found Charlie Finney's grave in a military cemetery in France. I found an obituary for an Eleanor Davies, who had passed away in 2011, survived by a daughter named Sarah. I found the official citation for my grandfather's medal, buried in archived military records. The dry, formal language described acts of breathtaking bravery that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was all true. Every word. The quiet man who taught me how to bait a hook had once stared down the very worst hell on earth to save his friend. The pieces of the puzzle were finally together, and the picture they formed was both heartbreaking and magnificent. I tracked down a phone number for Sarah Davies, Eleanor's daughter, in Chicago. My hand hovered over the phone for a full 10 minutes before I worked up the courage to dial. A warm, friendly voice answered. I introduced myself, my voice cracking. My name is, my grandfather was John Miller. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. And then, she said 4 words I will never forget. I have a letter. She explained that before she died, her mother had given her a sealed envelope. She told her, if anyone from John Miller's life ever contacts you, give them this. Sarah had kept it for over a decade, wondering if the call would ever come. She read it to me over the phone. It was from my grandfather. It was written the day after he received Eleanor's letter of absolution in 1952. He had written it but had never sent it. In it, he thanked her. He told her that her words had found their mark. He told her about my grandmother, Rose, and how her steady, gentle love was slowly helping him heal. He said he would never forget Charlie, or her, but that he was finally learning to forgive himself. He ended the letter with, "Tell your daughter about Charlie. Tell her that sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is not to fight, but to finally, after a long struggle, lay down their arms and make peace." He had found a measure of peace, after all. He had just never been able to share that part of the story with us. I went to see Sarah a month later. We met in a quiet cafe, 2 strangers connected by a secret history. She looked like her mother, she said. She had the same eyes. She showed me the photograph of Mary, Charlie's sweetheart. She had never married. She had passed away in the late 90s, still wearing the engagement ring Charlie had given her before he shipped out. We cried together, for the lives that were lived and for the lives that were lost. For the love stories that were cut short and the ones that endured in a different form. We promised to keep their story alive, for Charlie, for Eleanor, for John. For all the quiet heroes who never speak their pain. I returned to the farm. I stood on the creaky porch where I had asked him so many times about the war. The silence was different now. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence filled with the echoes of laughter from 2 young soldiers, with the whisper of love letters, with the profound, dignified weight of a pain endured and a peace, however fragile, finally won. I finally understood his answer. Some stories are better left in the past where they belong. He wasn't hiding from the story. He was protecting it. It was too sacred, too painful, too beautiful to be reduced to a tale told on a porch swing. It was a story written on his soul. I look at my own hands now, and I see a faint echo of his. I hear his steady patience in my voice when I talk to my own grandchildren. His legacy was not the medal in the box. His legacy was the love he gave us, the quiet strength he modeled, the farm he tended with such care. He built a beautiful life from the ashes of a broken dream. And that, perhaps, was the greatest act of heroism of them all. So, you think you know the people you love, but their silence isn't always empty. Sometimes, it's the most profound story they will ever tell. If this journey into the heart of a silent hero resonated with you, if it reminded you of someone in your own life, then perhaps this is a story worth sharing. Like and subscribe if you believe, as I now do, that every quiet heart has a symphony waiting to be heard. I'd love to hear about the mysteries in your own family, because every family has a lockbox hidden away, waiting for the right moment to be opened.